Levi-Strauss, Frye, Derrida, and Shakespearean criticism. Structuralism can only collect differences. In order to vindicate the claim that it lays bare the true mechanisms of myth, it is necessary to show that differentiation is the whole of myth. If differentiation must be viewed as process, however, it cannot completely ignore the undifferentiated, at least as a starting point. Levi-Strauss takes this necessity into account. The undifferentiated is present in his analyses, but as that precisely, and nothing more, as a mere starting point which is never questioned for its own sake. In primitive religion taken as a whole, however, the undifferentiated looms too large to be entirely disregarded. We are told in L'Homme Nu that the undifferentiated belongs to ritual, and ritual to the undifferentiated. This is no more true, I believe, than the converse proposition, namely that differentiation is the whole of myth. In both myth and ritual, we have first the undifferentiated, then the differentiated. By exaggerating the role of the undifferentiated in rituals, Levi-Strauss compensates for its minimization in the case of mythology. This minimization is needed to carve out a domain in which structuralism can be declared completely effective, even though it has strictly nothing to say about undifferentiation and the undifferentiated. The present discussion has bearing on literary criticism. Literary structuralists take for granted that their object is sufficiently defined as differentiation, as the elaboration of a significant structure. What about those writers, Shakespeare for instance, who are obsessed with chaos, with the destruction of institutions and hierarchies, the reversal and obliteration of even sexual identities, with countless phenomena which amount, in other words, to a dissolving of differences? Can a methodology which cancels out all that hope to reach anything truly Shakespearean? Levi-Strauss, at least, is not blind to the problem, even though he does not tackle it. He treats with open contempt and disgust all that big, messy nonsense that lies too obviously beyond the grasp of his method. Literary structuralists have remained unaware of the difficulty. They take it for granted that great literary works are as alien to undifferentiation as Levi-Strauss hopes myths are. Already falsely, in my view. Structuralism would be useful if it led critics to some real questioning of the undifferentiated. What is its status in a work like Shakespeare's? Is it really that big, messy nonsense from which primitives and structuralists alike prefer to keep away, from fear it might contaminate them? In Shakespeare, as in the Greeks, the undifferentiated is closely associated with conflict. If this association is never given its due, it is partly, no doubt, because our minds rebel against it. To us, conflict is a matter of differences. There is nothing irrational about the Shakespearean view. Desire is mimetic. It always focuses on some object already desired by the model, and it necessarily brings disharmony and rivalry. Troilus and Cressida is obviously concerned with mimetic desire. There is nothing spontaneous in the passion of the two lovers. We might call them complete phonies if the standard by which they will be so branded, spontaneous passion, were not itself suspect of being the fruit of some mimetic suggestion. The Greek army is falling apart under the strains of mimetic rivalry. Troilus and Cressida is also a play in which culture is defined as a system of differences, of degrees, Shakespeare says, held together by degree with a capital D. This common differential principle is a purely social transcendence. What we have here is a striking example of a structuralism avant la lettre, with one major discrepancy, which is that Shakespeare is less concerned with systems than with their destruction, through mimetic rivalry. Shakespeare talks of a shaking, a wizarding, and finally a collapse of degree, which takes place through hubris, inordinate individual ambition that tries to appropriate degree itself. This would be a neat trick, indeed, if it could be done, but degree vanishes as it becomes an object of rivalry, being nothing really but the mysterious absence of such destructive rivalry in times other than the crisis. Hubris and mimetic desire are one. in the sense that whoever appears to lay his hand on degree becomes both the model and the rival. Mimetic rivalry, thus, is a quest for difference that destroys whatever cultural reality there is to differences. Mimetic hubris is the equalizer par excellence, all the more powerful for going undetected. The end result of the struggle is the stupid reciprocity of reprisals between undifferentiated antagonists who are going mad as they see degree itself oscillate faster and faster between each other. These antagonists are the protagonists of tragedy and comedy. We may define their relationship as one of doubles in the sense of a true reciprocity and concrete identity, a sense completely alien to the notion of doubles in Romantic literature, in the essay of Rank on the double, or to Freudian narcissism. When the Greeks, when Shakespeare, when Molière adapt a mythical theme, the differences which remain immutable and sacrosanct with the structuralists tend to dissolve into conflicts of doubles. This is the better interpretation, obviously so in the case of such fake specificities as mythical twins and socias, often plainly produced through some divine intervention, a disguise, for instance, or a supernatural insemination, or both, as in Amphitryon. The same goes for plagues and other scourges, for man-eating dragons and monsters of diverse kinds. Structuralism has nothing to say about the universality of these themes. We may assume that great tragedy and comedy revivify some crisis of degree from which myth has emerged in the first place. Shakespeare not only dissolves differences into crisis, but, as he does it, he explains what he is doing. That is why, in Troilus and Cressida, to my mind at least, he is the greatest mythologist and interpreter of the Greeks ever. Literary structuralism does just the opposite. It loses the violence of the doubles. It is quite literally mythical in the sense that it redifferentiates once more, just as mythology does, what the tragic writer takes such pain to undifferentiate. Structuralism claims that its view of difference is truly scientific, but in the Levi-Strauss of Mythologique, no distinction is made between two types of differences which science, it would appear, cannot afford to confuse. 1. The difference between a real eagle and a real crow. 2. The difference between the two moieties, or the two clans of the eagle and of the crow. Levi-Strauss will say the same thing of all these differences, that they are part and parcel of the human mind. If we choose science and objectivity, shouldn't we say that the difference between the real eagle and the real crow is part of nature before and above being a part of our minds? If we do so, we immediately realize that the difference between the two moieties is something else again. As the scientist looks at the two moieties, he will surely find that they must be defined not by their differences, but by their identities, or at least their similarities, in all possible areas, such as demography, institutions, even the space they occupy, even sometimes their physical shape. These identities are perpetuated by an explicit or de facto reciprocity in all types of exchange, matrimonial, economic, etc. This does not mean that the difference between the moieties is merely subjective or a matter of pure classification. It is experienced by the natives, even though in religious life, as everywhere, reciprocity dominates. It is not without reason that the first explorers who discovered the moieties chose such a word for them, designating in them two moitiés, two identical halves of a single whole. Historically, no doubt, all human cultures have tried to convince themselves and others that the differences they set up are as objective, stable, and permanent as the differences between natural species. In this respect, Totemism is exemplary. It exemplifies vividly what might be called, to use a Sartrean expression, the project of all human culture. The question is, should a scientific anthropology ratify and perpetuate that project? When it does so, of course, anthropology has not only totemism and mythology on its side, but all of philosophy, implicitly or explicitly. It is Thomas Aquinas, I believe, who says somewhere that the differences between angels, if not yet human individuals, is equivalent to the difference between species in the rest of nature. This, of course, is the type of statement a Kierkegaard would eagerly take up. And he did, only to be applauded by the French Heideggerian Jean Beaufret, who gives his imprimatur to the doctrine in his Introduction aux philosophies de l'existence. Les choix et les animaux sont surtout les représentants d'une espèce alors que dans l'homme c'est l'inverse. One wonders what meaning can be attached to such a statement. Biologically and culturally, individual men are much less autonomous than most individual animals of the same species. As for animals of different species, they usually treat or disregard each other in a way which men could not imitate, even for a single day, without endangering their survival. If something is specifically human, it is a mutual dependence with the consequence that human relations must include a good deal of reciprocity, reaching down to the most essential and intimate aspects of human existence. Does this last observation contradict the universality of cultural differentiation? Rather than a mere contradiction, what we should perceive at this juncture may well be the essential paradox of human culture. In all human culture, reciprocity must be there, and it always is, but it is also inevitably covered up, at least in part, as well as distorted and often effectively suppressed, to an extent so great that not only the progress, but the very survival of culture may be imperiled. Why? If the crisis of degree is taken not as an imaginary, but as a real threat, an answer may suggest itself. Man cannot survive without reciprocity, but, historically at least, he cannot survive either when reciprocity becomes too explicit. When mythical differences weaken, reciprocity breaks out in the open as the reciprocity of conflict, rather than as the reciprocity of peace. Mimetic competition becomes so acute that social life itself is endangered, and ritual rigidities come back to the fore. Differences are reborn from their ashes. The statement of Levi-Strauss about cultural differences being in the human mind cannot mean, of course, that cultures never die. It would be simply absurd. In order to become meaningful, if not unequivocal, this statement must signify that, historically at least, men have never managed without cultural differences. Thus interpreted, this statement opens the possibility of crises of degree, of a temporary dissolving of differences out of which these same differences, or, if not the same, others will be somehow generated and stabilized once more. The question of cultural genesis, at least in relative terms, is not as far-fetched as it appears. We are dealing not with history in the traditional sense, but with a generative process which, in all likelihood, must be more standardized than the differences it produces. Myth and ritual tell us that differences are generated from that state of undifferentiation which we now identify with the reciprocal violence of the doubles. If we consider both this grounding in the uniform doubles and the fact that differences vary from culture to culture, we may wonder if there is not something random and haphazard in their production. Judging from the elaborate means sometimes devised in order to introduce an element of chance in the selection of the sacrificial victim, we must assume that ritualism may sometimes correctly observe this cultural throw of the dice and try to reproduce it, while it mistakenly interprets it as an expression of some divine will. This means, of course, that the primordial event must be a murder, just as Freud magnificently surmised. Not, however, the murder of a specific and identifiable individual, as he erroneously added, but the murder of a random victim, which must appear as the embodiment of the whole crisis, the sum total of all monstrous undifferentiation through a process of collective transfer made possible by the mimetic undifferentiation of the doubles. It is thus, I believe, that totemic ancestors, gods, and demons are generated. It is thus that degree is restored, that the difference is stabilized once more between a now sacralized violence and the community. All this, of course, is a complex hypothesis for the detailed exposition of which I refer my readers to La violence et la sacrée. Once this hypothesis is clearly understood, the evidence from myth and ritual will be found, I believe, overwhelming. I am well aware of the problems and objections this hypothesis must raise. Some have already been answered. Others are not suitable to the present occasion. All I can hope, in a paper like this one, is to add a footnote to a text which is not under your eyes. I warn my readers, therefore, that a certain familiarity with La violence et le sacré is necessary to a full understanding of the following and preceding remarks. In order to prove its merit, the hypothesis should help demonstrate, among other things, that the thrust of our knowledge is in its direction. This is an enormous task, of course, which cannot be attempted here. We may think it impossible, on the grounds perhaps that anthropology and the other social sciences are retreating more and more from all broad questioning in the religious field. But we must be aware that progress in such matters may be realized in roundabout fashion and in unlikely fields, like literary and philosophical criticism. Among many possibilities, I would like to single out briefly what looks to me like two outstanding instances of such progress. The first is anatomy of criticism. Northrop Frye includes among his archetypes the figure of a typical or random victim, which begins to crystallize in domestic tragedy as it deepens in ironic tone. We may call this typical victim the pharmakos, or scapegoat. We meet a pharmakos figure in Hawthorne's Hester Prynne, in Melville's Billy Budd, in Hardy's Tess, in The Septimus of Mrs. Dalloway, in stories of persecuted Jews and Negroes, in stories of artists whose genius makes them Ishmaels of a bourgeois society. The pharmakos is neither innocent nor guilty. He is innocent in the sense that what happens to him is far greater than anything he has done provokes, like the mountaineer whose shout brings down an avalanche. He is guilty in the sense that he is a member of a guilty society, or living in a world where such injustices are an inescapable part of existence. Just as Frazer gathered ritual analogies around the Jewish figure of the scapegoat, Northrop Frye gathers literary analogies around the Greek figure of the pharmakos. The reason for going Greek in literature are obvious as the reasons for going Jewish in religion, but they are no more compelling in one case than in the other. The English word scapegoat designates a particular ritual form, as well as the spontaneous violence that strengthens a threatened community at the expense of a random victim. Curiously enough, neither Frazer nor the Fraserians ever pondered the relationship between these two acceptations and their possible implications for cultural forms. The pharmakos of Northrop Frye inherits this double semantic polarity which remains unexplored. The need for radical analysis is hidden behind the catch-all notion of archetype. At one extreme, the pharmakos looks like a literary theme, a traditional topos, readily identified by ordinary scholarly procedures. At the other extreme, the pharmakos is the non-ritual one, the random victim of spontaneous violence. Apropos of the mystery story, for instance, the so-called thriller, Frye writes that its growing brutality comes as close as it is normally possible for art to come to the pure self-righteousness of the lynching mob. Frye's most interesting insights, at least to me, cannot be subsumed under the ritual heading of the pharmakos. They are an implicit revelation of the lynching mob as a generative force behind all myth and ritual. In the demonic aspects of literature, the social relation is that of the mob, which is essentially human society looking for a pharmakos, and the mob is often identified with some sinister animal image, such as the Hydra, Virgil's Fama, or its development in Spenser's Blatant Beast. The reason for which authors like Frye or Frazer privilege institutions like the pharmakos or the Jewish scapegoat is, of course, that more of the original mechanism transpires in these rituals than in more recent forms. The writer's intuition gropes toward that mechanism itself. Failing as it does to apprehend this mechanism, it falls back on the ritual forms that are closest to it. Is there a connection between the pure self-righteousness of the lynching mob and the fact that the collective violence comes out as something other than itself? An animal image, perhaps, or, why not, a plague-ridden city which can be cured only by the expulsion of a parricidal son. A lynching mob must believe in the malevolence of its victim, which means that the lynching process described by the lynchers themselves must necessarily come out as something other than itself, as the Oedipus myth, for instance. The reference to a pharmakos archetype here is only indirectly suggestive, and it is so for reasons which can become fully intelligible only through the generative effect of the single victim, if we assume that it is present behind everything. The generative effect, which remains for the most part hidden in Anatomy of Criticism, is more fully uncovered in the work of Jacques Derrida, notably in an essay which I read, of course, in the context of the above remarks, La Pharmacie de Platon. Derrida shows, quite convincingly, I believe, that in the text of Plato, the difference between Socrates and the sophists results from an arbitrary expulsion of the latter, invisible to both the author and the readers, because it is effected through an unconsciously systematic use of certain semantic ambiguities. The pivotal word, lo and behold, is the word pharmakos itself, and its cognates, notably pharmakon, which means both good and bad drug, medicine and poison. The drug can work either way, just like violence itself, which is poison but may become its own cure through the single victim effect and the ritual reenactments of that effect. Plato keeps shifting between the two opposite and yet related acceptations of pharmakon in the manner best calculated to confound the sophists and justify Socrates, thus differentiating a relationship that is truly undifferentiated. A relationship of hostile reciprocity in that crisis of degree that is Athens' golden age. In the case of physical violence, the cure is genuine insofar as the community is truly reunified against the single victim. Insofar, therefore, as the evil qualities of this random victim are unanimously and uncritically accepted. The same is true in the case of the Platonic text, except, of course, for the purely verbal means of the philosophical expulsion. Western philosophy, forever Socratic and Platonic, has always depended for its existence on the expulsion of its sophistic double, an expulsion which remains unperceived as long as it is sanctioned by the unanimous consent of all philosophers. After more than 2 millennia, this unanimity has come to an end, first with Nietzsche, now with Derrida's deconstruction. What is revealed is the dependence of philosophy on the same generative force, really as sacrifice, a force that retains its binding power only for so long as the people bound are unanimously blind to its arbitrariness. The fact that we are dealing with a sacrificial displacement is spectacularly underlined, of course, by the pivotal role of pharmakos, a word which originally designates a human sacrificial victim. Even though the displacement, substitution or metaphor, if you will, does not actually depend on any specific word, Plato's recourse to pharmakos is no mere coincidence. Even in the modern uses of pharmakos or scapegoat, we have already observed a double semantic polarity so slippery as to provide an ever-ready instrument, a perfect cover, and therefore built into the language a permanent incitement to the type of operation described by Derrida. Frye seems fully cognizant of the sacrificial displacement that constitutes certain literary genres. In his eyes, this element of substitution makes literature more civilized than sacrifice. This is certainly correct, and the terroristic conclusions some might be inclined to draw from analyses such as Derrida's are sacrificially regressive in their nihilistic self-righteousness. Frye is correct, therefore, but only up to a point. The vicarious element is not reserved to literature or baseball. It is already present even in the most gruesome forms of sacrifice. Being continuous in both directions, the chain of substitution may, at any time, reverse itself, and all complacency is, to say the least, premature. Are the present suggestions a blasphemy against literature? Would they, if followed, impoverish literary studies by limiting them to the identification of the right victim, as charged recently by a critic of my hypothesis? Earlier, to reach our definition of the doubles, we had to resort to Shakespeare. Among modern critics, the dogma of difference remains too powerful for a recognition of the doubles. Shakespeare knows that the doubles can be reconciled only at the expense of a common victim, and that is sacrifice. Romeo and Juliet is a case in point. The Montagues and the Capulets are the perfect doubles, totally undifferentiated in their stupid antagonism. A plague on both their houses. There is only one idea in the short prologue of the play, and it is repeated twice. The lovers, we are told, do with their death bury their parents' strife, the fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which, but their children's end, naught could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage. Can one object that the absence of the word sacrifice makes my reading questionable? Let all skeptics move from the prologue to the conclusion, where the same idea is repeated a third time, and this time the word sacrifice is included. Talking to Capulet, Montague, or is it Capulet talking to Montague, defines the two lovers as poor sacrifices of our enmity. There can be no such thing, of course, as a full and unambiguous revelation of the sacrificial mechanism. This revelation will immediately be turned into a reverse sacrifice. Let us suppose that Shakespeare is aware of this fact and annoyed by it. We may find that the enigmatic relationship between Romeo and Juliet on the one hand and on the other, the play that immediately follows, A Midsummer Night's Dream, becomes intelligible. In each play, we have lovers, and their predicament is the same. Two of the lovers in A Midsummer Night's Dream are separated by a father. In Pyramus and Thisbe, the play within the play, the resemblance with Romeo and Juliet is closer still. It is their parents' strife, we are told, that erected the wall that keeps the lovers apart. As we look closer, however, we must realize that, in all instances, the paternal obstacle is a sham. The lovers are left free to spend all their time together. They get into trouble, no doubt, but trouble of their own making. They are little erotic snobs who reduce each other to hysterics with their sadomasochistic shenanigans. They are a caricature, and Pyramus and Thisbe is a caricature of this caricature, the mirror in which the protagonists are too stupid to recognize themselves. Pyramus and Thisbe first lament loudly their cruel separation. Tired after a while of their own wailing, they remember that lovers should have rendezvous. Theirs poses no more problem, it now appears, than a night in a motel for two of our horrendously oppressed teenagers. Pyramus asks, "Will you meet me straightway at Ninny's tomb?" Thisbe answers, "Tide life, tide death, I come without delay." Act 5, Scene 1. The lion is not the cause of the disaster. Its roar is truly as gentle as that of the nightingale. The cause is a ludicrous misunderstanding, a stupid jumping to conclusion on the part of Pyramus, who thinks Thisbe is dead. This ending is not even a parody of the one in Romeo and Juliet. It is exactly the same course of events, the same melodramatic nonsense, and Shakespeare is making fun of himself. We feel Romeo and Juliet are somehow murdered. Their blood cries vengeance, and yet they alone are responsible for their own death. The only one who shares in their romantic ineptitude is their asinine counsel, Frye Lawrence. All are more or less guilty of generalized hysteria, compounded perhaps by a secret desire to monopolize the limelight. What does it mean? The critics are still afraid to ask. They are afraid to let the two plays confront each other, as if both might be lost. Shakespeare knows that fiction is and must be a lie. The audience is looking for its pharmakos, as Northrop Frye tells us, and even the tiniest little sign in one direction or another will send everybody charging like raving buffaloes, so long as someone is there to be trampled to death. The doubles will be tilted one way or the other. Better give them a strong and obvious tilt, in order not to be trampled oneself, or completely ignored, which is the same thing, really, for a playwright. The truth is also there, not even hidden, in full view, enormously visible and yet invisible, as if Shakespeare had wagered to some friend he could make his audience swallow even the most outlandish nonsense. From the very beginning, Romeo and Juliet would have to be read, and obviously was read, as the glorification of the young against the old, as the first great saga of the generation gap. Revolted by this first outpouring of romantic self-righteousness, Shakespeare wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream as an antidote. The nature and circumstances of the comedy, and of all comedies, are such that he had to make his point covertly once more, and he turned this apparent liability into pure genius, devising his two-tier arrangement, whereby the fantastic fairy tales and monstrous weddings on the upper level are secretly generated by the mad antics and wild scapegoating on the lower level. In an age like ours, when the excesses of the youth cult are reaching tidal wave proportions, the secretly implacable comedy is the more refreshing play, but turning it into more moralizing would be as un-Shakespearean as the opposite. If we look for Shakespeare himself, we will find him at the exact place where all the self-serving causes and ideological slants cancel each other. He is absolutely not relevant. In both plays, we must note, the author is visibly haunted by how little it takes to reverse the meaning of a text, to turn heroes into villains and villains into heroes, tragedy into comedy and comedy into tragedy. A mote will turn the balance. Which Pyramus, which Thisbe is the better? To change black into white, all you need is a half-turn of some Janus-like Pharmakos, or maybe a single comma moved 1 inch or 2. Through mistaken punctuation, Quince's entire prologue, meant to be a compliment to Theseus and guests, turns into insult. Such is the destiny of all language. In Romeo and Juliet, the theme of the ambivalent drug remains trivial, and Shakespeare should be blamed for giving it undue prominence, unless we read it as an allegory of drama itself, a fitting one in view of the ending. Frye Lawrence warns us about drugs. The most infinitesimal change in the dose and the substance that cured becomes the substance that kills. Like the dramatist, Friar Lawrence is an apprentice sorcerer, a philosophical pusher of sorts who hopes he has his dramatic cuisine well in hand. Everything should come out all right in the end. Just as the friar said, however, the unholy brew has a power that cannot be controlled. Saying it so well in the first place, and being fooled anyway, only turns the friar into a bigger fool. Oh, mickle is the powerful grace that lies in herbs, plants, stones, and their true qualities. For naught so vile that on earth doth live, but to the earth some special good doth give. Nor aught so good, but, strained from that fair use, revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse. Virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied, and vice sometimes by action dignified. Within the infant rind of this small flower, poison had residence, and medicine power. For this, being smelt, with that part cheers each part, being tasted, slays all senses with the heart. Two such opposed kings encamp them still, in man as well as herbs, grace and rude will. And where the worser is predominant, full soon the canker death eats up the plant. Romeo and Juliet, Act 2, Scene 3. In this explicitly sacrificial context of the play, none of this can be coincidental. Friar Lawrence sounds like Derrida's pharmacie in a nutshell. Will a critic do to Shakespeare what Derrida has done to Plato? Shakespeare has already done it himself. We might see him, perhaps, as a Socrates who would be his own Aristophanes and more besides, as a Plato who would be his own Derrida. Where does that leave the rest of us?